Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the quiet little town of Harrisonville, the streets echoed with the steady noise of cars and children playing in the distance. Yet, on some days, even this tranquility could be disturbed by disrespectful behavior. Samuel Thompson, an 88-year-old veteran, walked slowly along the sidewalk, his cane tapping the ground with a sure rhythm. Despite his advanced age, his posture remained erect, his eyes shining with a glow of determination and wisdom accumulated over the years. A decorated former soldier, he had endured battles many could only imagine, and survived where others had fallen. That day, he had no idea that an encounter was about to disrupt his peaceful stroll. 6 loud, arrogant motorcyclists appeared around the corner. Their roaring motorcycles made the ground vibrate, and their mocking laughter carried a clear message: they believed this elderly man posed no threat. As Samuel continued walking, the bikers approached, lightly jostling him and hurling taunts. But Samuel, with unwavering calm, looked them in the eye. Behind his quiet smile, an idea was brewing in his mind. These young men thought they would humiliate him, but they would soon discover that experience and courage are not measured by age or physical strength. A simple phone call would change everything. The sun was slowly setting over Harrisonville, casting long shadows on the sidewalk Samuel Thompson walked along every afternoon. His pace was slow but determined, his cane tapping the ground steadily. He nodded or smiled at passers-by, as he had for years. Suddenly, the roar of engines shattered the calm of the street. 6 black leather bikers appeared, their motorcycles roaring like angry beasts. The men, young and visibly confident, stopped around Samuel, forming an intimidating circle. "Well, look who we have here," one of them said, a mocking smile on his lips. "A little old man walking around all alone." The others burst out laughing, ostentatiously slapping their motorcycles and the ground with their boots. They jostled Samuel lightly, thinking they were testing his reaction. But Samuel didn't move. He looked up at them, his gray eyes sparkling behind deep wrinkles. He showed neither fear nor anger. Only a calm that was almost irritating to these young men who wanted to provoke him. "You enjoy annoying people," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You know it's not very brave to pick on someone my age, right?" Another biker snickered. "Oh, don't worry, man, we're just having fun." "What are you going to do? Call your little group of retired veterans?" Samuel gave an enigmatic smile. His fingers tightened around the phone in his pocket. The bikers, thinking the gesture was insignificant, continued to mock and laugh. Little did they know that this simple gesture would soon transform their arrogance into absolute astonishment. The bikers' laughter echoed through the street as they surrounded Samuel. Their arrogant gazes scrutinized the old man's every move, waiting for him to show some sign of weakness. But Samuel, true to his calm and thoughtful nature, remained motionless. He slowly raised his cane and tapped lightly on the ground, not out of fear, but to mark his rhythm, his presence. The young men exchanged amused glances, some mocking, "Look at him, does he still think he's a soldier or what?" Samuel slowly pulled his phone out of his pocket, holding it at chest height. The bikers burst out laughing, convinced that this old man was simply going to call the police or complain without any real impact. He dialed a number and spoke for a few moments, his voice calm but firm. Each word was carefully chosen, each syllable revealing a quiet authority. The bikers, too busy jeering, paid no attention to the disturbing detail. Samuel knew exactly who he was calling. A few minutes later, a distinct rumble was heard in the distance. It was no longer the sound of their motorcycles, but the sound of powerful, organized engines. Their laughter gradually died down as the bikers began to realize that Samuel's call had triggered something far more serious than a simple complaint. Samuel looked up at them, his enigmatic smile remaining unchanged. "Gentlemen, you have just awakened the elders." The bikers exchanged worried glances. They had just realized, too late, that beneath this quiet old man lurked a veteran whose reputation and allies could turn any situation around. Samuel's calmness contrasted with the panic that was beginning to rise in the group. What seemed like an innocent stroll would quickly turn into a lesson in respect that these bikers would never forget. The roar of engines was approaching quickly, filling the street with palpable tension. The 6 bikers, previously confident, began to look at each other nervously. Their arrogance now clashed with the unknown. Samuel stood still, phone still in hand, his eyes scanning the tense faces of the young men. Then, calmly, he spoke a few words into the receiver, his voice soft but firm. "Gentlemen, it is time to show what the word respect means." At that moment, several vintage cars and powerful motorcycles appeared around the corner. But these weren't just any vehicles. They belonged to war veterans, former companions of Samuel. Each driver had known Samuel for decades and knew he wasn't a man to be intimidated. The bikers stopped dead in their tracks, their mouths open. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by a growing fear. The vehicles slowly surrounded the scene, like a towering wave ready to engulf those who had dared to challenge Samuel. One of the veterans stepped out of his vehicle, his stern, respectful gaze fixed on the young men. Others followed him, each displaying the poise of a man who had faced the horrors of war and survived. Samuel lowered his phone slightly and looked the bikers straight in the eye. "Gentlemen, you thought you were humiliating an old man, but you've come to the wrong place. You've just awakened men who know what courage and loyalty mean." The 6 bikers stood frozen, unable to speak. Their laughter had given way to a heavy silence, filled with tension and forced respect. What they had thought was a vulnerable old man had just transformed into a lesson they would never forget. The engines of the veterans' vehicles slowly stopped around the bikers, forming an imposing circle. The men dismounted one by one, each displaying the stature and bearing of someone who had faced far worse than 6 arrogant bikers. Their gazes were stern but calm, as if gauging not physical strength but the true worth of the soul. Samuel stepped forward slightly, his cane still in hand, but his upright, confident posture commanded immediate respect. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "you think you intimidate the weak, but here you are surrounded by those who know true courage." The bikers exchanged frightened glances, some instinctively backing away. They suddenly realized that their arrogance was worthless compared to the experience and determination of these men. The tallest of the bikers tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. A veteran stepped forward and placed a firm hand on the shoulder of the most aggressive biker. "You should learn to respect your elders. We are not here to punish, but to teach." Samuel smiled slightly, but his eyes remained serious. He knew that respect couldn't be commanded by fear alone. This was the time to show the young men that true authority came from wisdom, experience, and courage in the face of injustice. The bikers, trapped and unable to flee without appearing pitiful, began to understand the silent lesson. This old man, whom they had believed to be weak, possessed a network and a courage that few could match. Samuel stepped forward and said, "What you did is not acceptable. But now you have the chance to correct your mistake." The wind seemed to carry away the bikers' last flashes of bravado. In this solemn silence, the lesson of Samuel and his former comrades resonated louder than any intimidation. Samuel stepped forward, his cane gently touching the ground, and fixed the 6 bikers with a piercing gaze. Every wrinkle on his face seemed to tell stories of battles and sacrifices, lessons the arrogant youth of these men had never known. "Gentlemen," Samuel began, his voice firm but measured, "you thought you could intimidate an old man. You were mistaken. What you call courage is nothing compared to the respect we owe others, especially those who gave their lives to protect this country." The tallest of the bikers, still trying to hide his fear, replied with a nervous smile. "We didn't want any trouble, just a little fun." Samuel shook his head gently. "Fun isn't built on the weakness of others. Arrogance and intimidation aren't signs of strength, but of weakness. And today, you were lucky enough to learn that lesson without suffering the most serious consequences." The veterans behind Samuel nodded silently. Their mere presence carried the weight of experience and military discipline. The bikers, now visibly intimidated, looked down, ashamed of their behavior. One of the veterans addressed them gravely. "You have the opportunity to make the right choice. Listen and learn. Respect is not something you beg for, it is something you earn." Samuel took a step closer to them and added, "I don't seek confrontation, but I will never hesitate to stand up for what is right. You have a choice: change, or leave with the weight of your ignorance." Silence fell over the street. The bikers finally understood that this was not just another old man they had underestimated, but a man whose life had been shaped by courage, loyalty, and discipline. Samuel's lesson now penetrated their arrogance like a flash of truth they would never forget. The silence that followed Samuel's lesson hung heavy over the street. The 6 bikers, frozen, no longer dared to move or speak. Their initial arrogance had disappeared, replaced by fear mixed with hesitant curiosity. Samuel looked at them one by one, his gaze clear and firm, but imbued with a quiet wisdom. Then, against all expectations, he sketched a slight smile. "I'm not here to punish you. What I want is for you to understand. True strength is not measured by the fear you inspire in others, but by the respect you give." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. None of them had anticipated such an unexpected approach. The younger one whispered, You don't blame us?" Samuel shook his head. "Anger doesn't transform men. But learning does. Today, you have a chance to grow." He gestured to his former comrades, who nodded and smiled slightly. Together, they invited the bikers to spend the afternoon with them, listening to their stories of war, camaraderie, and courage. A unique opportunity to understand that true power lies in experience, humility, and loyalty. The bikers, initially hesitant, finally agreed. They had been humiliated, but in the most noble way possible, not by violence, but by example and wisdom. Samuel concludes with a soft but firm voice. "What you did today defines you. If you let this lesson transform you, you will come out better for it." Thus, what had begun as a humiliating confrontation turned into a profound life lesson. The young men understood that brute strength is nothing without wisdom, and that age and experience can sometimes overcome youth and arrogance. The afternoon wore on slowly. The bikers, still reeling from their encounter with Samuel and his former comrades, finally agreed to sit with them in Harrisonville's Central Park. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and the rustling of leaves, but a palpable tension remained in the air, a mixture of curiosity and shame. Samuel began telling his stories, not to impress, but to teach. He spoke of distant battles, fallen comrades, silent sacrifices, and lessons learned in situations where fear and courage mingled. The bikers, initially distracted, began to listen, fascinated despite themselves. A veteran, Michael, Samuel's former companion, addressed them. "You think life is measured by the speed of a motorcycle or the fear you inspire. But true courage is protecting those who are weaker, being loyal to those you love, and respecting those who came before you." The bikers, sitting on the edge of a bench, began to understand. Their bursts of laughter from a few hours ago seemed to belong to another time, to another person. Each of them reflected on their actions and the impact they had had on Samuel. The tallest one, whose behavior had been the most aggressive, finally looked up and whispered, We didn't realize." Samuel nodded kindly. "No one is born with all the knowledge they need. The difference between a man and a child is knowing how to listen and learn from their mistakes." Little by little, the young men began to ask questions, listen respectfully, and show genuine interest in the veterans' stories and experiences. The initial fear had given way to humility and admiration. The afternoon turned into an unexpected moment of sharing, where the young people learned from the experience and wisdom of those who had lived far more than they could have imagined. Samuel, sitting among them, smiled gently. What had started as a simple stroll had become a true life lesson. The sun was slowly sinking behind the hills of Harrisonville, tinting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The atmosphere in the park was quite different from that of a few hours earlier. The bikers, still a little self-conscious, had begun to show signs of a change in their attitudes. Samuel watched them intently, a slight smile on his lips. He knew that understanding a lesson is one thing, but putting it into practice is another. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "the real test is not what you have learned here, but how you will act in the real world tomorrow." The youngest biker, shy, spoke. We would really like to do something to fix what we did. To show that we understand. Samuel nodded. Very well. Start by respecting those you meet, helping those in need, and showing your courage in a way that doesn't harm others. Encouraged by the veterans, the bikers spontaneously offered to visit a veteran center and help with community activities. They wanted to prove that they could act with honor and respect, not intimidation. Samuel turned to Michael and the other veterans. Look at them. They still have a long way to go, but what we have sown today can grow. True strength is contagious. As the bikers engaged in small acts of kindness and mutual aid, their faces softened. The arrogant laughter was gone, replaced by genuine smiles and gestures of respect. Samuel's lesson was beginning to bear fruit, transforming not only these young men, but the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood. As dusk enveloped Harrisonville, Samuel felt satisfied. He had shown that even a quiet, thoughtful 88-year-old could inspire change, not through brute force, but through wisdom, courage, and example. The following days marked a turning point for the 6 bikers. Harrisonville residents began to notice the change in them. The same men who, just days earlier, had been intimidating passers-by, now stopped to help elderly people cross the street, assisted children with their bikes, and participated in community activities. Samuel continued to guide them discreetly. Every time he saw them act respectfully or courageously, he nodded in satisfaction. But he never failed to remind them. Respect is not just what you show to others. It must become your way of life. One afternoon, the group met at the community center to organize an activity with children. The bikers, nervous at first, became fully involved. They smiled, laughed, and told stories, not to impress, but to share and inspire. A resident, who had witnessed the initial incident, approached and said, "I never thought you were capable of such a change. It's incredible." The tallest of the bikers, red with shame at the thought of what he had done, replied humbly, "We learned a lesson we will never forget. Thanks to Samuel and his friends for showing us what true courage means." Samuel, observing the scene, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a living example that age and experience could transform even the most arrogant minds. The bikers were no longer the same. Their arrogance had given way to reflection, respect, and gratitude. As the sun set, Samuel reflected on this lesson: true strength lies not in inspiring fear, but in changing lives, transforming behaviors, and inspiring respect through example. A few weeks after the incident, Harrisonville had changed, and so had the 6 bikers. Their arrogant and impulsive behavior was now a thing of the past. Every action, every daily gesture, testified to the lesson Samuel and his former comrades had taught them. One morning, Samuel was strolling down the main street again, greeting the locals with his quiet smile. He spotted the 6 bikers, cleaning the motorcycles with their own hands and offering their help to passers-by. There was no sign of mockery or arrogance, only respect and humility. The younger one approached Samuel and said sincerely, "Mr. Thompson, thank you. You showed us what courage and respect truly mean. We will never forget that." Samuel placed his hand on the young man's shoulder and replied, "You have learned a lesson not just for today, but for your entire life. True power lies not in force or fear, but in wisdom, example, and respect for others." The veteran continued his walk, satisfied. He had transformed not only 6 young men, but also a part of his community. He knew that at 88, his age might make some doubt his ability to act, but he had just proven that courage and wisdom transcend the years. This story quickly became known throughout Harrisonville. Samuel Thompson was never celebrated for his physical strength, but for his ability to teach, inspire, and change lives. The 6 bikers, now transformed men, carried this lesson into their every action. And so, the calm of Harrisonville was never the same again. A lesson of respect, courage, and dignity had been forever engraved in the hearts of all who witnessed that extraordinary day.